my best guess is that top line populism will follow along with millennials and Gen Z as they continue to age. So I do suspect that that will have a permanent effect on the sort of contours of the GOP.
Well, hello out there in podcast land. Welcome to a new edition of the Liberal Patriot Podcast. I come at you every couple of weeks with the very finest and heterodox conversation and analysis with the most interesting and stimulating guests. And today I'm happy to have Emily Jashinsky. I don't know if you follow Emily's work, but if you don't, you should. She is a Washington correspondent for On Her, the excellent UK-based site. And she's also written previously a lot for the Washington Examiner and the Federalist. And I think she's just one of the best young political journalists around. And she's particularly astute, I think, on currents within the conservative movement, within the new right and hot and cold running right or whatever. There's a lot of stuff going on there. And we'll be getting into all that, as well as assessing recent developments in Trump to the fast-breaking, never boring political landscape we live within now. But I thought we would start by looking at these intro-right currents, which I bet a lot of people who listen to this podcast don't really know that much about. So let's start with, what's the difference between the old and new right? And who's in what bucket? And who are the players here?
This is such a loaded question, Roy.
Wait a minute. It's just informational.
Yes. Well, first, I'll say thank you for having me. I've long relied on your work, so I really appreciate being here. And the reason that question is so loaded is that the new right was once considered something different than it is now. The new right was a thing decades ago. Charles Kessler has written about this in recent years and others, but today's new right is really the new right, and it's I know
my head is spinning. Yeah,
I think probably the most important distinction between the new right and the quote unquote old right is fundamentally this sympathy or empathy, maybe is the better way to put it, with MAGA. Old right is still very anti-MAGA. New right, I think that's probably that's like the easiest way to separate it. But if you go beyond that line, there's all kinds of stuff that comes downstream of being new right, meaning you could be post-liberal. JD Vance has identified himself as a post-liberal. He's really been a thought leader in that space. You could be a classical liberal who is frustrated with this very iteration of classical liberalism. You could be the tech right, more libertarian and more interested in lax regulations towards things like crypto. So it's just this massive umbrella category. And I think probably the most helpful way is if you see somebody who's on the right, they're probably running in, quote, new right circles if they are fundamentally empathetic to the cause of MAGA.
Okay, so you're saying there's no real intellectual coherence to the new right beyond a certain level of loyalty to the Trumpian right populist movement. You got classical liberals, you got post-liberals. I mean, it doesn't seem like it fits together terribly well as a philosophy of government.
You know, it's very interesting because there was a National Conservatism Statement of Principles that was issued by the Edmund Burke Foundation, NatCon World. They have a conference now that's sort of a parallel post-liberal version of CPAC. And they put out this National Conservatism Statement of Principles a few years back. I actually signed it. And then something called FreeCon, associated with Avik Roy and others, put out their own statement of principles, reaffirming the principles of the Sharon Statement of September 11th, 1960.
Which you used to be associated with, in a sense, right? Back.
Yeah. And, I was at the American
Because your organization, you were once with head of YAF or something, which goes back to that statement. Is that right? Do I have that right?
Yeah. So, and I'm still actually on the board of Young America's Foundation. Okay. And that was my first job out of college, was the spokeswoman at Young America's Foundation, which owns the Reagan Ranch. And I went to me, that's why these two statements are so interesting. And I've written about how they're actually not mutually exclusive. And I think that's why MAGA is a better litmus test for old right and new right. Like, if you are icked out by MAGA, you're probably old right. And if you are sort of able to empathize with it, you're probably new right, because Within the spectrum of new right, you do have, people who still believe in what's probably best described still as fusionism. So combining, and I think Trump himself might even be in this category, strong national defense, traditional values, and free markets. So you still have people who are very much best classified by that description of fusionism. You have people in the new right, JD Vance is one of them, who are post-liberal and can't stand fusionism. You have
Right, right.
people who are very much like Ron Paul affiliated. You have Tulsi Gabbard, a longtime Democrat. So it's hard to say. But yeah, I mean the Sharon statement and fusionism, which grew out of the 50s, especially the 50s, and then into the 60s, 70s, and the Reagan Revolution was sort of the apex, was organized around anti-communism. That's fundamentally what the Sharon statement was about, and it was about bringing together all of these different strains of thought under the banner of anti-communism. We are better than the
Right.
communists because we believe in individual freedom. We are better than the communists because we believe in religion. We're better than the communists because we are stronger than them. We will be stronger than them in
Hmm.
terms of national defense and our presence on the world stage. And so that I don't think is really out of step with a lot of people. It may be out of step with people who are more like actual isolationists, and there are some of those people in the new right. People who are hardcore libertarian crypto people who are also on the new right. But for the mainstream new right person, a lot of that still stands. They just sort of hate what's detestable to them is the posture of the old right, the gatekeeping of places like National Review that didn't want anybody like Donald Trump to come in, blow up the status quo, and erode these norms, these sort of classical liberal norms that have developed over decades.
So the new right is defined as much as anything. I mean, beyond, let's leave Trump aside, this kind of anti-elitist kind of thing. They thought the old right was too tied into conservative business interests, to elite gatekeepers, I mean, they were not part of the solution. They were part of the problem. Um, and
That's well said. Because
yeah,
Patrick Deneen wrote a whole book basically about how, and he's a post-liberal thinker. He wrote "Why Liberalism Failed," which Barack Obama once put on a summer reading list. And the reason I think that makes sense is Deneen wrote a book about how you need a new elite,
hmm,
and that is sort of debated in post-liberal circles. But I mean, it's a pretty popular idea. But it's fundamentally anti this elite, even though it's written by a sort of highfalutin Notre Dame professor. And that's where you have the Venn diagram overlapping between a Marjorie Taylor Greene and a Patrick Deneen.
yeah, fascinating. But they're kind of winning, aren't they? The new right. I mean, you kind of allude to this in some of the things you've written. I mean, like there used to be something called Freedom Works. I don't know if anyone remembers it anymore, which was,
Mm-hmm.
kind of the thing for a while, and they just, gone with the wind. And now it's all the action, all the energy is around, whatever coherent, whatever things unite the new right. It is the new right, and the old right is kind of like nipping at the heels, almost, of this emerging movement. Um, do you think that's right? Are they really winning as much as I'm characterizing it, or is that overestimating their strength?
No, I think that's totally right, and that's why partially we don't know if the post-liberal foreign policy is going to replace neoconservatism. We don't know if post-liberal economics are going to replace neoliberalism. Like we actually just have no idea because there's a tug of
Right.
war happening in MAGA right now, but MAGA has won. So the kind of the brand has won, and what it actually means is being worked out in real time. But what we do know it means is that the next Republican presidential candidate is not going to be Jeb Bush. They're not going to talk like Jeb Bush. They're not going to believe the things that Jeb Bush believes. But like most importantly, they are not going to talk like Jeb Bush. I think that's probably the most important thing. They might smuggle in anti-populist policies, but they will have a populist brand, if that makes sense.
Yeah. How much staying power do you think the economic piece of this has? Because speaking as someone who has not been part of the conservative movement, I'm more an interested observer. I mean, it is striking how different. We used to all the debates between conservatives and liberals about economics fundamentally more than anything else, right? It was like, how more big a role should the market play? What should the government do? Which programs work? Should we have any I mean, this was like the core debate. And that seems to have been superseded at this point because there's quite a lot of overlap in terms of, uh, sort of the robustness of government and its role and whether interventions are good and bad. Now, Democrats are basically in a position not of saying Republicans or the new right, they don't want to intervene in the economy. Everything they do is wrong. But they're not arguing anymore about whether the market should take care of everything because nobody seems to believe that anymore. And I think that if that sticks, that does represent a sea change in the right. I mean, because that was such a huge part of the fusionist. It was the economic part of the fusionist philosophy, and now it seems like it could be, going under for the third time.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, it's unpredictable, but my best guess at this point would be the economic populists will now have a seat at the table that they didn't
Hmm.
have before. So in a post-Trump world, you will hear people continue with a much louder voice in the conservative movement to question things like tariffs and cooperation with China and selling out industry for national security with national security concerns and hollowing out communities. Like those people they have interest groups within the conservative movement now, places like American Compass. The Heritage Foundation actually has people on staff
Hmm.
who have built careers sort of making those arguments now over the last decade. So I think those people are going to have a seat at the table. I don't think it's going to become the dominant strain. And one of the reasons I think that is just a couple of years ago, the Chamber of Commerce was fully like leaving the Republican Party, and the Republican Party was leaving the Chamber of Commerce. You could hear, Kevin McCarthy
Right,
talking
right.
trash about the Chamber of Commerce when he was Speaker of the House.
Uh-huh.
And their donations were starting to go more to Democrats. And this was a really stunning reversal. But that I don't think is going to be a trend that continues. I believe we've seen that with all of the business interests showering the Trump administration with donations, lots of lobbying. I mean, I think it was like a record level of lobbying in the last 6 months, so the first months of this Trump second administration. So
Hmm.
they've been pretty. I mean, the tariffs are not the business community is not happy with the tariffs, but they're getting a lot of deregulation. They still think that they're getting a lot out of the one big beautiful bill. So basically, the only community that was happy with the one big beautiful bill was the business community. So
Oh, that's
uh,
interesting. Yeah, because I think relating to the debates we've been rehearsing between old and new right, free cons and net cons. I mean, you wrote a piece for basically arguing nobody's happy with this, really, in terms of those currents. I mean, it was like this ridiculous, sort of Rube Goldberg contraption of a one big beautiful bill that really made nobody happy, but had gestures toward everyone. But you're saying at least there was one entity that was happy, and it was like kind of a traditionally happy about Republican politics kind of group, the business community. So that's interesting.
yeah, I think that's true. And also, I think the other constituency that was happy, and you would know this better than I do, but immigration hawks, I think we're happy with the bill. Those might be the two. And that's, I think, fundamentally changed in the Republican Party. There will never be a return to the 2012 autopsy Republican Party on immigration.
Yeah, no, it certainly doesn't seem that way. Um, Thinking about how important in a way, we talk about the one big beautiful bill. It really didn't have much to do with the net cons and the free cons. Are these debates even important, right? I mean, you brought in something in one of the pieces you wrote I thought was interesting. Basically, these people are arguing, but they're up here somewhere. They're up above
Yeah.
the conservatives in the electorate, and they're barstool conservatives. These are people who don't have any kind of coherence about their views. They're fundamentally populist, anti-elitist. They have a mix of all kinds of positions. And isn't Trump basically a barstool conservative fundamentally? I mean, he's like the leader of the gang. And then you got the nat cons and the free cons arguing like crazy about what's the right type of conservatism. But in the end, it's really a different entity that they can't quite suss out, or they can't quite describe, and they certainly don't control.
Yeah, I think Trump really likes the vibes of someone like Stephen Miller, but there's plenty of daylight between the two of them on immigration policy, which again, you know this better than I do, but
Hmm.
Stephen Miller's built his argument on immigration fundamentally in anti-elitist framing about
Hmm.
how hospitality and agriculture relies on this underclass that's mistreated and exploited. And Donald Trump has blown up that entire argument just in the last couple of months by saying we need carve outs for hospitality and ag
Right,
because
right.
they're getting hit so hard. And I think he's pragmatic more than he's ideological, even within the issues that he's most ideological on. In his first term, he was considering coming to the table with Nancy Pelosi on DACA, which a lot of people forget because he likes making deals.
Right,
And
right.
if you look at like a Joe Rogan, he's been uncomfortable watching ag workers swept up or watching college students picked off the streets. And so I think some of this stuff is, Stephen Miller's he's a good example because he's an intellectual architect of Trumpism, but then Trump sometimes just vetoes the intellectual architecture and you have to kind of rebuild something if you're Stephen Miller in its place, or just try working, quietly in the background. But yeah, I think that's true. Trump it trickles, with Trump, it trickles down, but also the base trickled up to what Trumpism was, and now he decides what it is. But he was listening to constituents in a way that the conservative movement, which is kind of cloistered in Washington, kind of lost track of. They thought, I remember talking to Thomas Massey with my colleagues at the Washington Examiner in like 2018, 2017, and he said he was reflecting on the like libertarian moment that Time magazine declared like 2012 to 2014 during the Tea Party years. And he said, he said, I used to think going around campaigning for Ron and Rand, so Ron Paul and Rand Paul, that people in Kentucky were really excited about libertarian ideas. And then when Trump came along, I just realized they were only interested in the craziest son of a bitch in the race. Like they just wanted someone crazy to go in and blow everything up.
Blow it up. Yeah, I mean, that's what the people want.
Right.
Yeah, though I think the tendency is there everywhere to try to impute intellectual coherence to something that doesn't have it, even if you're on the other side in a way. I'm just thinking here of the very interesting interview that Ezra Klein did with Yoram Hazony. I don't know if you read that or listened to it. I mean, it was because he's one of the architects of the NatCon statement of national conservatism. And Klein was just basically starts out this interview by a long thing about how basically JD Vance is a nut, and like basically clips showing that he basically wants to put all the cat ladies in jail or whatever. He's not a fan, and I think he was trying to. The reason he's talking about zoning is like he's the intellectual heft or guru behind Vance. And it was interesting. I thought in the interview, I mean, Klein was just relentlessly pushing Hazony about his the terrible implications of what he said and how he said it. And it was almost like at some point, it's like, look, if you just admit you're a Nazi, we can end this end this interview and everybody could be happy and go home. But I mean, Hazony was remarkably, I thought, composed. I mean, he was trying to explain his point of view. I don't think it's exactly what you're saying, but I think there's this real urge on the part of a lot of people to impute a coherence and an ideology that maybe isn't there so that they can oppose it, if you know what I mean, instead of trying to understand it. I mean, Trumpism is an enormously complicated phenomenon, and Vance is a complicated guy. But if you can like bucket him up with some sort of appalling intellectual, philosophy that he adheres to, it's a lot easier to kind of handle it in a way. Do you think there's anything to that, or are people making mountains out of molehills here?
No, that's interesting because I did Ezra's podcast. It must have been right after he talked to Yoram last year, and he had done so much reading. Like he had read all of the critical books, like Virtue of Nationalism from Yoram, and more than most people in these spaces have probably read at that point, and he had a really good kind of command of the landscape of the New Right movement. But that's where it's sort of like the New Right itself. How much does it represent an actual, because sometimes it's easy to take like Curtis Yarvin, for example, basically a neo-monarchist. He's spoken at NatCon, which Yoram organizes. And so if you're somebody who's trying to understand the movement, you're in Ezra Klein and you see Yoram, Virtue of Nationalism, and then you see Curtis Yarvin. Yoram's a Burkean, not in like the way that Curtis Yarvin might be considered Burkean in a sense.
No, they're pretty different animals. Yeah.
Right. And so it's one of those things where it's almost like there's an internal language that if you go to all of these things and you talk to all of these people, and this is a danger for the New Right, because you end up just speaking your own language and getting as self-obsessed as the progressives that you've criticized for a year, Ruy, have had on their own side, because you just end up speaking this language that only you understand, and other people on the outside will never be able to put the picture together because they're not one of you. I think some of that is true, but yeah, that's the thing. Like, it's easy to look at a Curtis Yarvin as an exaggeration of what somebody like Yoram has calmly and I think with great intellectual heft put to paper. But then as soon as Curtis Yarvin's involved, it like blows everything up because now
Yeah,
all of the
yeah.
questions have to be about Curtis Yarvin or another good example, John Eastman at Claremont.
Yeah, I mean, do you think this is a problem? I mean, from your point of view for the left that they tend to want to reduce these political figures to something that can be usefully and nobly opposed, right? I mean, in a way, I think Vance is a great example of this. I think people are desperately trying to figure out a way to characterize him in a way that it will underline how terrible he is, how he's not as much of a threat as people think. He's an empty suit. He's a nut, um, without taking account of the fact he's actually like a darn good politician, and he can present all kinds of problems for the Democrats. But somehow I think it comforts them in a sense. They say, "Oh, he's a Hazoniite," and we know what that guy's about. This crazy, nationalist, and I don't know. I mean, I think it's interesting. I think in the effort in sort of the effort to understand, they wind up not understanding, and that's kind of a weakness and leaves them unable to really mount a kind of effective opposition. Do you think that's
Yeah.
fair? Uh,
Yes, it drives me crazy because probably in the same way that your observations of the like far left drove you crazy for a long time. Because when I look at JD Vance, if this was a JD Vance presidency, not a JD Vance vice presidency, there are a few things that I think would have been different. I don't
mhm.
think that big beautiful bill would have touched Medicaid. Like I don't think they ever would have touched entitlements under JD
Right.
Vance presidency. I think he would have made a big deal about drawing an absolute red line on that question. I think you might have seen a legitimate Iran nuclear deal, unlike what Donald Trump did. I think you actually may have seen something totally different on that front. They're just like JD Vance is a genuine post liberal, and for the left there is a lot. Like, he has cozied up to labor, he has made a big deal of doing that, and you don't have to believe the guy. You don't have to believe that he's sincere or anything other than opportunistic, but
Right.
let's just take them at their word and say he's being opportunistic, which I don't think. I think he is a sincere convert to all of this. But if that were the case, even so, he still believes that the Republican Party fundamentally needs to look more like the populist left on economics and on foreign policy. And so, by, I think, dismissing JD Vance as a white nationalist or a white nationalist adjacent, by obsessing over, for example, his Curtis Yarvin ties, which are interesting and I think newsworthy, but making that such a focus and a definitional
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I agree.
affiliation, you miss all ability to sit down and work with him, and maybe get some stuff onto the table. Like, Josh Hawley has worked with Bernie Sanders on capping credit card interest rates. JD Vance is the vice president and sympathetic, very much sympathetic to those types of things. He is under a president that is very pro business in many ways, and an administration that's very pro business in many ways. So he's, it's not his economic agenda. But if it were, uh, the left would be foolish to dismiss him
Yeah,
as a white
yeah.
nationalist fascist, because then you're just missing out on like actual accomplishments for working people.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, I can tell you based on conversations I have with people on the left or, garden variety suburban liberals. I mean, you bring up JD Vance and it's like they do not take him seriously. They do not understand. They do not.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, he says this. He doesn't. He hates unions. He's a white man. All this stuff. It's like this is like a much more serious problem for you than you can't get rid of the guy just by categorizing him in this way. It's not going to work politically, and it's not even true, really. But I just think it's remarkable. I mean, we were both at the American Compass
Mm-hmm.
gala, I think, and we heard JD Vance was interviewed by Orrin, and
Mm-hmm.
if people like listen to the guy for more than 5 seconds, you realize, I mean, this is a serious talent with a coherent philosophy, and he actually believes in what he says. Now, you may think he's going about it in the wrong way. That's fine. And maybe he is an opportunist in some ways. All politicians are, but I just think it's striking the level. It's almost like denial. They're in denial about the level at which this kind of politics poses a threat to the Democratic Party. It's so much easier just to dismiss it. And in a way, I think it's makes it easier too that this is in the shadow of the Trump administration, right? So you were talking about how a Vance administration might have been different, but it's not. Vance, it's a Trump. So all the ways in which they hate the Trump administration, they can, it helps them discount that there could ever be a successor to the Trump administration that could be any different, because these people are all just authoritarian so-and-sos. Nobody's sincere about anything. This is totally the deal. Uh, it's interesting. I just think that they're not prepared. I guess that's how I'd put it. They're not prepared for the hand-to-hand combat that may lie in the future in a post-Trump world. Though I guess, you could argue too that maybe there won't be a post-Trump world. What do you think about that? Are they just going to blow themselves up? I mean, this is what everybody on the left is hoping for. It's a completely incoherent economic policies. It's overreaching everywhere, issues from immigration to the universities to whatever. By the time 2028 rolls around, they'll be completely discredited, and we'll just get back in there, and we won't have to worry about JD Vance anyway. We'll just beat him, because Trump. There's no way this can possibly work. I think this is a fundamental assumption. And I know you have your criticisms of the Trump administration too. So what do you think? I mean, is this incoherence going to fundamentally undermine them in a big way over the period of an entire administration? I mean, now it's like they're kind of, a lot of stuff's getting done. The what hasn't hit the fan yet, but do you worry that it will, and this will basically blow up? I mean, nat cons, free cons, any kind of cons, they're going to be out in the cold again.
Yeah, there's this huge unanswered question of how Donald Trump leaves office. Is it after an attempted third term? Is it, JD Vance running, as they've actually discussed with NBC a few months back, JD Vance running and then ceding the spot to Donald Trump? Is it calmly because a Republican president is elected in 2028, Vance is elected or whatever, and Donald Trump can step down and sort of just enjoy what he sees as a very popular legacy, 3 terms of Republican presidents, at his hands, at least at that point. One thing I think we know for sure, I think back a lot to January 6th, which I covered on the ground sort of accidentally, because I was covering the president's speech at the Ellipse and ended up walking over there with people because I could tell something was happening. You could, on Capitol Hill, just feel, in a weird way, this collective sigh of relief from Republicans who thought that as scared as they were, as horrified as they were, they had this weird giddiness that they were finally rid of Donald Trump, that Donald Trump had finally done the thing. He had finally shot someone on Fifth Avenue. And we knew at that point that he was disgraced and they could all move on. Very quickly, It was clear to us that was not happening. That was not happening. And that was a huge lesson for Republicans who I think realized, if Trump, for example, had turned his head just an inch differently in Butler, Pennsylvania last year, he would have been a martyr and his ideas would have been enshrined in gold in the Republican platform for decades into the future. So it's hard to say what really happens. But I do think, on your point about, I was thinking about this, what you were saying, like Josh Hawley, for example, everyone said his career was over after January 6th. There was no one who wanted to work with him. He was seen as toxic. Democrats said he was, enabling authoritarianism and all of that. And what I think is really important about this example is that if Bernie Sanders had said, I'm not touching toxic Josh Hawley because he's an authoritarian, rather than, by the way, somebody who personally I disagree with, this idea of the elector scheme that they had cooked up and were voting against. But Democrats had done the same thing many times. And instead of dealing with that, Democrats just said toxic, can't work with him. Well, Bernie Sanders said, I can actually get something that will wreak a real blow to the credit card companies if I work with Josh Hawley, and I can start getting traction, and we'll see what happens with that bill. But this is what happens when you categorize people without dealing with the substance, is you lose actual opportunities. So I don't know what becomes of Trumpism, kind of because Trumpism is such a culture war hot potato that it's so hard to predict how he leaves, if he leaves, dare I say, It's really hard to say.
Yeah, I mean, and I think sort of one thing that prevents sort of more constructive engagement with the other side uh, is from the standpoint of, you mentioned January 6th, right?
Mm-hmm.
Finally, everybody thought, well, this is the Trumpism has ended. He's gone too far. This will blow it up. But I think people are still waiting around. A lot of Democrats and never Trumpers and whoever, um, for the thing that is finally going to bring him down. Right?
Yeah, Epstein.
This this will be it. Epstein, exactly. I wanted to talk about that. I mean, it was only a couple of weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago. This is it. The MAGA base is in revolt. They're finally losing faith in Trump. It's all going to go south from here. We finally have him, and it didn't happen. I mean, don't these people learn? I mean, what's going on? I mean, why this sort of this touching faith that eventually the anvil will fall on Trump?
I think, yeah, because again, this gets back to one thing you were mentioning earlier about the dichotomy between the DC right and the broader public, and you can apply that to the left too. But it's
Right,
it's
sure.
sort of if you're in professional conservative world, in the professional conservative world, you just are analyzing things to death. You're not just like living life in the same way that the average American is. I always say the biggest bias in journalism is being a journalist. It's not even ideology; it's just the way you follow the news is so different than your consumers. So I think with Epstein, I do think it had substantial and will continue to have substantial downstream effects on that professional coalition. I think a lot of trust has been lost between, like a Marjorie Taylor Greene, genuinely an important ambassador for the president's ideas to average Americans and the grassroots, and Pam Bondi, the president himself. But it's not what anyone's voting on.
Right.
It contributes to the vibes, but the vibes that people care about even more are going to be the bills that they have to pay. And so it's so obvious, but it is so easy for people in the DC bubble to lose track of that, because you live in a different life. And yeah, I think it definitely threw a wrench into the coalition, and that wrench is still there. But to the average voter, it probably seems weird. They probably still have a lot of questions they want answered. It's not going anywhere for Joe Rogan and Andrew Schultz and the podcast guys. But for the average voter, they're always going to care more at the end of the day about their groceries.
Yeah. Well, what about Israel? You've written about that recently too. And speaking of Marjorie Taylor Greene, she famously has kind of broken with the orthodoxy on this. Is this a danger to the MAGA coalition? It's sort of hard for me to believe a foreign policy issue at this point could do that, but there does seem to be a lot of fairly violent disagreement about this now in conservative ranks.
It's fascinating. I mean, I was thinking about this hypothetical the other day of like, Marjorie Taylor Greene came out and said that what Israel's doing in Gaza is a genocide. She shattered the taboo and used that word. And what's fascinating is I don't think in 2014, for example, Marjorie Taylor Greene, the incentive structure for someone, a member of Congress, a Republican member of Congress, popular with the base, to do that, you would have been blacked out on Fox News. You would have been blacked out across most of the media if you said that. And because of that, you would have had no ability to reach a lot of people. Like all of those channels, basically, almost all of them have been cut off, except for maybe Twitter. But now she can still go on Newsmax. She can go on Bannon's show. Bannon himself has been really critical of Netanyahu. It's the incentive structure, because the gatekeepers have so much less power, has shifted. And if you look at the polling, I think it's like 71% of Republicans are still very supportive of what Israel is doing right now. Huge gulf between independents and Democrats. Independents are at 25%, Democrats are at 8%. So Republicans are kind of out on an island on that. But if you look at that generationally, Pew did a survey, I think it was back in April, showing how different the favorability towards Israel is among younger conservatives, younger Republican leaners than it is among, and it's stunning. I mean, it is a huge gap. And so I think it's going to keep showing up more and more and more. And the incentive structure is just shifting. Again, it's not something everybody votes on. It's not something most people vote on. But I think it's changed the incentive structure, where Republicans for years just relied on their base sort of giving them the benefit of the doubt and reflexively trusting what they did on Israel. That, I think, is gone.
Yeah. The age cut is interesting on this. Do you think that this is a harbinger of how the new right, in a sense, may evolve in the conservative movement? Because people under 40 or conservative are so different than people who are older, and including, I mean, not just Israel, but lots of other issues. So are we basically, if we look at the age breaks on a lot of these issues, is this really the future of the conservative movement, of the Republican Party? I mean, maybe we're almost underestimating how much the new right is going to win. They're going to get tired of winning because they've got they've got the youths. I mean, so this is like kind of important, right?
Super important.
Do you see what do you think is going to be? I mean, obviously there's a particular issue like Israel. How do you think this kind of age dynamic will play out in some other issues that are in dispute in the conservative movement?
You know, one thing I think we see a lot in politics is that the president that captured the imagination of people during their generation. So like this is Reagan won the youth vote twice, once really
Right.
handily, and boomers are still really animated by the Reagan rhetoric. And Trump actually used this. Obama and Mitt Romney, of course. There are a lot of examples of that, and I suspect that Gen Z and millennial voters, and they will be a huge swath of the electorate at one point, already becoming that way,
Right.
will always have been kind of forged in this populist fire. I don't know about Gen Alpha. Maybe they'll be anti-populist. I'm not sure.
Hard to say.
But
Yeah, there's no
yeah,
good
it's
data.
hard to say. But I do think this big swath of voters is going to remember this era that way, whether they were Bernie people, Trump people, and Trump means so much to so many different people. He means a lot to the pro-Israel people because, you know, the embassy was in Jerusalem now because of Donald Trump. But he also, like, anti-Israel people sort of see him as their champion too because he's talked tough to Netanyahu. I mean, it's all, he is just the ultimate ink blot test. You can see so many different things that you want to see in Donald Trump. So I just, my best guess is that top line populism will follow along with millennials and Gen Z as they continue to age. So I do suspect that will have a permanent effect on the sort of contours of the GOP.
Yeah. And you can certainly see it in the Democratic Party as well, that the younger, parts of the Democratic Party tend to be the more populist parts. Though it's interesting, I guess you could also say, I mean, is that helpful for the Democrats? Whereas you might argue that populism on the right is actually somewhat helpful for the future of the party, but there's certainly an argument that could be made that, sort of Mamdani style populism is probably not going to really help the Democrats in big areas of the country, even if it does animate some important parts of their base. So it's kind of like a mismatch, I guess you could argue. I'm not sure that's true. It's just a thought that occurs to me.
It's so interesting because you have Dan Osborne in Nebraska, and then you have Zohran Mamdani in New York City. And somebody like Zohran Mamdani, who has a lot of the same economic policies of a Dan Osborne-ish. I'm sure Osborne would not be for government grocery stores or anything like that.
Probably not,
but he's generally, supportive of populist agenda on economics, healthcare, all that stuff. Mamdani comes with a decade of insane populist left baggage on culture issues, meaning
yes.
queer liberation is defunding the police and whatever the heck else.
Yeah, well, I mean, New York City is going to be a gender affirming care sanctuary. So, what's not to like about that, right? That'll totally sell in Peoria. Yeah.
Right. But that's the thing is like these millennial populist lefties come with that culture war baggage that they are not. I mean, Mamdani is trying to do this pro-cop thing now. We'll see if it works out. But if you're a New Yorker who's voting on crime, you're going to be bombarded with this guy's defund the police stuff for the next several months. And so that will affect the way you vote. On the other hand, if you're a populist like Dan Osborne, who literally comes off the shop floor and is a veteran, he said I interviewed him last year. He said he's personally against abortion, but he's pro-choice, like literally the most common American position. So he doesn't come with all of that baggage. So if for Democrats, populism looks like Dan Osborne or like Bernie Sanders, just plainly stopping his conversations about the culture war baggage. We'll see to what extent that can work for others. But if it's Dan Osborne, that'll be good for them. If it's Zohran Mamdani, that won't be good for them nationally at all. So it could go either way.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I think part of the problem here is I think there are different populist currents in the Democratic Party represented by people like Osborne and Mandani, but who gets the ink, right? I mean, this is a
Mm.
problem with controlling the commanding heights of cultural production. I mean, the kind of people who write about politics, who write about culture, who are pundits, who are I mean, these are people who were really interested in Mandani, and they're not very interested in Dan Osborne. So, of course,
Right.
they're going to, I mean, this is going to be a huge deal. When he becomes mayor of New York, and I think he will, it'll be endless, endless, endless stories about him. How many stories are going to be about Dan Osborne, whether he wins, loses, whatever? Not very many. So, in a way, it's like they're almost imprisoned by the fact that they really are culturally dominant. In America, in a lot of the key media outlets, and as you say, the biggest the biggest bias in journalism is just from journalists. And journalists, I think, are by their very nature at this point, their class background, their political leanings,
Mm-hmm.
they're really much more interested in Zoran Mamdani than they are in Dan Osborne, and I think that's like a prob. So, I don't
Yeah.
want to be too gloomy here for my Democratic comrades, but I do think it's a bit of a problem. Whereas I think that the populist energy among, on the right is probably a little bit more productive for the party as a party and for reaching a broader swath of the electorate. I'm not sure, but that's the way it looks to me. Um, so, do you have any hope for? I mean, okay, we've talked about JD Vance, right? JD Vance looks like the guy, right? Who else is out there? Who can stand in his way? I mean, Marco Rubio, and I think the sort of old school Republicans don't have much of a chance. But do you think it's like done and dusted, or who's going to be the standard bearer? And of course, we don't know what I mean, Donald Trump could decide like 3 years from now, I hate JD Vance, and he's
Mm.
the worst person in the world. So, what do you think? What's the message from inside the conservative world about that?
People really like JD Vance. I think by far the most formidable candidate, having covered him for a long time, is Marco Rubio, because Rubio has a he's I think people who don't pay close attention to him dismiss him as sort of like an establishment shill robot because Chris Christie bullied him off the stage back in 2016 for saying the same canned line over and over again.
Right,
But
right, yeah,
he's really gotten a lot stronger since that. He is a deep student of just as deep as JD Vance is on some of these like intellectual discourses happening on the right. He surrounds himself with people who are deep students of that and active participants in it, just like JD Vance does. And I think he has a charisma that Vance lacks. I think Vance is like actually
really
pretty
interesting.
talented
Talk about that.
politician
Why do you think he has more charisma than Vance?
because I think he combines new and old in a way that Vance is more new. So
Hmm.
JD's kind of off the cuff podcast era
Right,
political talent. He can sit for 3 hours on Joe Rogan.
right,
I
right.
think,
Hmm.
but he's not necessarily a captivating public speaker at like a rally, for example. Whereas Rubio, who came out of the prior populist Tea Party era, actually is really
Yeah, yeah.
captivating when he talks about Cuba and socialism and his experience
Right,
growing
right.
up. And he's very, very, I think, rhetorically talented. So he has a little bit. He can do the new media podcast thing. I think he just sat down like Megyn Kelly again, but he can also do the old thing. And he's
Hmm.
very deep on the issues too. So that's where I think Rubio comes in. But who knows if Trump passes the torch to Eric or Don Jr. Trump,
So
which
weird.
could
Yeah,
easily happen,
my
or
head's
maybe
gonna explode. Yeah.
maybe Laura Trump, who really seriously considered, she's the co-chair of the RNC right now, really
Right,
seriously
right.
considered that North Carolina Senate run. So it could, it could be a family affair into the future.
Sure. I think that's a really interesting point about Rubio, though. And going back to that American Compass Gala we were both
Mm-hmm.
at, it's interesting that
Mm-hmm.
Rubio gave a speech and Vance did a sort of conversation with Orrin Cass. So
Mm-hmm.
it really did speak to their strengths in different ways. And I was very impressed with Rubio. I wonder also if he'll be helped by the fact people don't hate him as much as they hate Vance. I mean, sort of
Yep.
the cultural blob out there. It's like Rubio, yeah, he's a Republican. I don't like Republicans, but Vance is like the great Satan to a lot of people for some of the reasons we've been touching on already in this conversation. I wonder if that'll help him too in a way, or maybe it won't. Maybe in the context of a Republican primary, it would actually like hurt him. That too many elites are tolerant of him.
Yeah, no, I think his tech affiliations would be a problem. I don't know. I mean, I can't see them running against each other because I
Mm-hmm.
don't think they would. They're really good
Oh, really?
friends.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think they would. I just find that unlikely. And I think if you're Marco Rubio and the former vice president is running, you probably cede to him. But all that is to say, the tech stuff I do think is a problem for Vance going forward because I mean we're going to see what happens with crypto and everything in the years to come. But the
Right.
Teal connections, I do think the strain of anti-elitism is strong enough in the Republican
Interesting. Yeah.
electorate to be really, really uncomfortable with that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
There are just enough people who are really uncomfortable with it that it could be a problem for him. Whereas Rubio's basically a career politician, so you can maybe try to tie him to the Gang of Eight immigration bill, but he's already developed a
Yeah,
pretty
yeah, that's old
eloquent
hat.
articulation of yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, I personally like JD Vance. I think a problem for both of them is going to be the student um, like free speech questions of the Trump administration. I don't think that's going to age particularly well. I think they'll have a hard time with that. We'll see how the
Yeah, and
one big
Rubio's
beautiful
very
bill.
associated with that. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, well, they
Mm-hmm.
both have problems, both Rubio and Vance. But yeah, no, that's interesting. Well, in terms of the tech thing, one thing I've been kind of puzzled about in a way, maybe you can shed some light about this, is where did this like why are they all in on crypto stuff? It just seems sort of unwise to me. I mean, there's obvious potential economic problems with emphasizing this. I mean, it's not really the future of the country, right? Or of the economy or of anything. But there seems to be a somewhat uncritical embrace of crypto in in Republican circles. And I suppose more in the Vancian wing than not. Do you think this is like a big deal, or is this just eh, they're for it. It's not a big deal. It's just another thing they're pushing, or is this actually potentially a point of vulnerability?
I think it's a huge deal. And I'm one of the more anti-crypto people on the broader right, so I'm
Hmm.
biased on it. But I think you know, the it all happened when Trump was shot. Like that was the turning point for crypto, to be honest, because
Hmm.
Elon Musk basically immediately offered his endorsement. He had been backing Ron DeSantis, and DeSantis was already out of the race
Right.
by that point, but he immediately went in on Trump. The tech world, we saw Mark Zuckerberg basically immediately say that was really badass. And we saw in general Silicon Valley warming up to Donald Trump after that moment. And what they discovered was a sort of receptivity that I think, because of the reasons we were talking about earlier, they always underestimated. They underestimated Donald Trump as a pragmatist and always
Hmm.
thought it was better for them, like Jeff Bezos, for example, who sicked the Washington Post on Trump to basically describe him and report out these stories as though he was this dictator in his first
Right.
term,
Right. Yeah.
flipping and realizing he can actually have a very friendly, pragmatic, constructive relationship from his business perspective with Donald Trump. And a lot of that started to happen after Butler. You saw the domino with Elon Musk, and then everyone else was like, oh, maybe he will listen to us. And maybe because we'll shower him with money, he'll give us a seat
Hmm.
at the table that we didn't have before. The Winklevoss twins got in on the fun. And after that, Trump realized he could make a ton of money. And when Trump sort of waved his wand, then everyone else fell into place. I think it's just undeniable. I don't know if it's sticky
Hmm.
because Trump himself was really critical of crypto for a very long time. He was like, it's basically fake. What are we doing with this? Not a
Yeah.
big
Yeah.
fan. And then
Hmm.
as crypto started spending on him and cozying up to him, he
Sure.
realized he can make a ton of money off of it. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I
So
mean, I think
it
he's
kind of comes in with the tech mafia, the crypto stuff,
right.
and he sees the advantage of it politically and also in terms of his own personal economic fortunes. And it's just, but I mean, this is the kind of thing that can really, I mean, cozying up. I mean, having tech on your side is great. Maybe being associated with crypto so intimately is not. I mean, depending on what happens in the future. I mean, the critique that crypto is fundamentally, speculative asset. It's always struck me as pretty true. And like a lot of speculative assets, it works great until it doesn't. So, um, yeah, I wonder if they may come to regret their enthusiastic embrace of all things crypto. We shall see.
And my crypto friends will say, "Oh, so you just said speculative asset? You mean like the dollar?" And I'm like, "Yeah, yeah, but this
Yeah,
is not a new like this is Donald Trump attaching himself to something very specific. So like the politics
right,
of it,
right.
like I don't disagree that the dollar has its own problems, but if you're a politician and the dollar is a problem for your constituents during your time in office, that's a problem for you politically too. So the politics of it, that doesn't really change. If
Yeah.
there's a crash and you're the crypto
Hmm.
president, you own it. Now, Trump is really Teflon, so he can go
Hmm.
back to his older statements. And we saw some people do this on the Iraq war too. And, say, I always thought
Right.
it was a bad idea. Maybe I voted for it, but I'm on the record
Now that
saying I
you
thought it was a
mention
bad
it,
idea. So he could maybe go back and do that too. But it's if there's a crypto crash, Republicans there are a lot of people, normal people, are going to get caught up in that, not just sort of crypto elites.
yeah, no, I agree with that. So there's a lot of moving parts here in this endless competition between Republicans and Democrats, and even within the Republican Party. And I hope that you have found this conversation with the great Emily Jashinsky helpful in sorting it all out. And I think we can also safely say there's much more to come in terms of how things work out. It's all to play for. Nothing is settled. And so hold on to your popcorn and we'll see what happens in the future. And I want to thank you, Emily, for being on the Liberal Patriot podcast. And I'll offer you what I always offer my guests: come by AEI and I'll buy you lunch. And I know you're not far away. Isn't the unheard, layer on just on the other side of DuPont Circle? So come on by.
And
And I
and
urge
Ruy,
everyone.
thank you. I was going to say, as a longtime AEI intern from 2012 to 2014, I know that whatever you pay for my lunch will be greatly discounted.
Oh, absolutely. And it's great food. I mean, this is
It's so
like,
good.
people don't
Yeah.
understand. AEI is the place to go to get great food. So anyway, that's it for today. I guess you got to read Emily's ongoing, writings and Unheard. I think you'll find it quite instructive in understanding our unfolding political drama. So until the next podcast in a few weeks, I'm going to be talking to Ted Nordhaus of Breakthrough. So sayonara.